Too Spanish. No air. Another Catherine. Another Catherine. Man, none of these queens are going to give me a son. How am I supposed to breathe with no air? Don't you dare start groaning. That was funny and you know it. All right, yes, I know. Henry VIII did not have a phone and he definitely did not have Tinder. But he did go through 6 wives, all in pursuit of having a son to take over his throne. And believe it or not, that marital strife directly corresponds with the continuation of the Reformation. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Reformation Part 2. Let's go. All right, so last video we talked about how Martin Luther's 95 Theses, other writings and teachings changed the world forever, diminishing the power of the Catholic Church and challenging previously held worldviews, most specifically that of the penitential cycle. And we left off with the Augsburg Confession, which sort of established the Lutheran Church. And leading up to this point, there's actually a spread of Luther's ideas throughout Europe, thanks to the ideas of the Renaissance, humanist worldviews, and of course, the printing press. Yeah, see, other people agreed with Luther, and they began to challenge the Catholic Church as well. There's a number of them in particular who contribute to the greater Reformation as a whole, the Protestant Reformation. In fact, the word Protestant basically means to protest. So this is an ongoing change movement within the church where we're protesting against the Catholic Church. I can't go through all of the different reform movements that took place during this time, but I'm going to highlight 3 other ones that are all sort of contemporaries of Martin Luther. And I would argue they never would have happened if Luther didn't write the 95 Theses. So in a lot of ways, they're followers of Luther. Just 2 years after Luther's publishing of the 95 Theses in 1517 and the events that followed, in 1519, a pastor of a small church in Zurich, Switzerland, named Ulrich Zwingli, began his own mini-reform movement. He too, like Luther, was very critical of the Catholic Church and its financial motives, and was aware that most of this wasn't biblical. Much like Luther, Zwingli believed that the church as a whole needed to return back to the truth of the Bible. He said this: "The business of truth is not to be deserted, even to the sacrifice of our lives. We live not for this age of ours, but for the Lord. To admit anything that will diminish or violate the truth is silly, not to say impious. To have held fast to the purpose of the Lord is to conquer all adversaries." So just like Luther, Zwingli promoted this return to the Bible. Have people actually read and understand it for themselves and make sure that the theological practices of the church match that which is promoted in the Bible. Like Luther, he also promoted a reform of the Catholic Church. He didn't necessarily want to leave it, he just wanted to fix the problems that were there. And many of the problems he thought existed were because of the Catholic Church's numerous traditions, right? These rites and rituals that had been practiced for years that really didn't have theological merit. One such thing was the practice of Lent. Now, Lent itself is a good thing that most Christian churches recognize, right? That time of reflection on your sin and, more importantly, the death and sacrifice of Christ. But a long tradition in the Catholic Church was for the 40 days of Lent, individuals couldn't eat meat. It was sort of a fast that was meant to cause people to self-reflect and pity themselves in the eyes of God. That's where Friday fish fries come from. More modern Catholics don't necessarily fast for all of Lent, but on Fridays they won't eat meat, so that's where the fish fry came from. It's also where the McDonald's filet of fish came from, because so many Catholics in America wouldn't buy burgers during Lent that McDonald's was losing money, so they introduced the fried fish and you had an interchange there. Although in the 90s, McDonald's also offered a different option, alternative to the burger. It was called the hula burger, and instead of a burger patty, it was a ring of pineapple that was covered in cheese. It's real, I can't make this up. This specific practice Zwingli had an issue with because he didn't think it was necessary to cause so much pain and change your diet in order to reflect on Christ and reflect on Lent. So him and his buddies had a cookout at church. Brats. You could really go for a brat right now. Yeah, that's right. They grilled some sausage in an event that was known as the Great Sausage Controversy of 1522. Zwingli began to protest against the church by eating meat during Lent. One of Zwingli's followers was actually arrested by the Catholic Church for this protest, since he was the one who actually was grilling the brats. The point is that the Great Sausage Controversy drove Zwingli further from the church, and he began to get a little more radical in some of his reform movements, and it became clear that he had some similar ideas to Martin Luther. The new church that Zwingli would form was similar to Luther's, and it was called the Reformed Church. Now, unlike Luther, Zwingli believed that the Lord's Supper was actually just a symbol and a reminder that there was no means of grace. That's an entirely different theological conversation, probably for a whole other video. And Zwingli was radical in that he thought they should actually fight against the church. And as Switzerland divided itself up amongst either the Catholic Church or the Reformed Church, he actually organized a group of Reformed states to come together and fight the Catholic states and ended up dying in battle. Regardless, Zwingli left an impact, much like Luther. He had challenged the church and was relatively successful, and his follower would become even more famous. His name was John Calvin, and like Zwingli, he believed in this reform movement within the church, and so much of his ideas were based in the Bible too, just like Zwingli and just like Luther. Calvin said this: "The gospel is not a doctrine of the tongue, but of life. It cannot be grasped by reason and memory only, but is fully understood when it possesses the whole soul and penetrates to the inner recesses of the heart." See, the Bible is important. It's what makes Christians who they are. It's their way of life. It's their doctrine of salvation. It shows how to work. And just like Luther, Calvin believed in the importance of the word itself. But Calvin had some pretty different beliefs too. Most notably, Calvin had a different belief about how salvation worked. It was called predestination. It basically states that God already knows who's going to be saved. In fact, he's actually already chosen or elected those who would be saved. That's actually different from what Luther believed. Yes, God is all-knowing according to Luther and certainly knows who will be saved. But the fact that God only has a certain set amount of people to be saved didn't really fit with Luther's beliefs about things like grace through faith and free will. See, Luther said that as long as you believe, you could be saved. So technically, you could choose to not believe as well and reject that faith that the Holy Spirit has put inside of you. Calvin said that the only people that have faith and actually act on that faith are the ones that God had elected. It's way more complex and confusing than that. I wish I could explain it more, but we have to get to some of the other things here. That belief really is what separated Luther from Calvin. Now, there was the debate about communion that Zwingli and Luther had as well. That continues with Calvin. But overall, that's the biggest change between Lutheranism and Calvinism. Calvinism does spread quickly throughout Europe, especially into Switzerland and then into Calvin's native home of France. And so much of it came from Calvin's very clear teachings, which he implemented in his own theocracy in the Swiss city of Geneva. He ran it like a biblical state, often using the laws of the books of Exodus and Leviticus. Calvin also took away a lot of entertainment and other fun things in order to keep people focused on God in a very radical sense. But once again, we have another individual who has separated from the Catholic Church, created a different theology, and it's continued to spread the Reformation as well. But here's where it gets fun. Let's cross the pond over to England and meet up with our friend, Henry VIII. Whoa, easy there, big fella. Yeah, Henry VIII was a larger-than-life figure in history, if you know what I mean, not just because of his personality. But he's one of the most influential rulers in English history as well. He comes from the Tudor family, which had kind of taken over England after the War of the Roses. And Henry, like most English monarchs, was a staunch Catholic. In fact, he was given the title by the church Defender of the Faith because he wrote a letter that was anti-Martin Luther. He tried to shut down the 95 Theses. In the midst of this Defender of the Faith situation, there's some trouble at home. See, Henry was married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. She was actually Spanish, and she was unable to produce for Henry a male heir. Now, like most rulers, Henry wanted a male heir in order to take over his kingdom and pass on the family name. Because of this, Henry wanted to find a new queen who could potentially give him that heir, so he needed to remove his marriage. Well, marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church, and divorce is very much looked down upon. So Henry asked the church for an annulment. It's not exactly a divorce, it's actually more so where the church makes the marriage completely disappear. It never existed. Well, the Pope says, no. So Henry turns to the newest church authority, Martin Luther, and asks him that if he joins the Lutheran Church, can he get a divorce? Luther says, no, you wrote that letter against me, so definitely not. And Henry realizes he has one option to get this annulment. Why not create his own church? Loophole. And that's exactly what Henry does. He creates the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and it was different from the Catholic Church in one way. It didn't have a pope. In fact, the highest authority in the Church of England was, you guessed it, Henry himself. Henry then appointed the Bishop Thomas Cranmer as the pseudo-head of the Church of England, who rewrote the theology and basically took Catholic doctrine and turned it into the Anglican Church. Now, there were many people in England who were still Catholic who opposed this new church, including Thomas More, that guy who wrote Utopia. He was actually killed for opposing Henry. Regardless, Henry now had his own church, and he had the ability to file for divorce. Annulment. Well, that led to his marriage to Anne Boleyn. And there was some drama in that marriage, so Henry got married again, and again, and again, and again, and through it all, he only had one son who actually died at a very young age. Regardless, Henry had created a new church. It's another part of the Reformation spreading, and what's ironic about the Church of England is it's basically just a copy of the Catholic Church with a few subtle differences. Henry died in 1547, and his son Edward took the throne, but eventually died after, as I mentioned already. This left Henry's next descendant, his daughter with Catherine, Mary, who had been banished to Spain, as the new Queen of England. Also known as Bloody Mary, Mary was Catholic and probably resented her dad for a lot of different reasons. And when she came back, she tried to make England Catholic again and killed a bunch of the new Protestant people or members of the Church of England and earned the wonderful nickname Bloody Mary. Yeah, lovely lady, as you can see. But when Mary died in 1558, Henry's other daughter, Elizabeth, took over, and she might be one of the greatest rulers in all of English history. She looked to strike a balance between Catholicism and the Church of England in England. And she did it by creating a new theological book, the Book of Common Prayer, an act of uniformity which made the Church of England very similar to the Catholic Church and established that both versions of Christianity could practice within England, with England itself relating to the Church of England. All right, so why is this important? Well, again, it shows the spread of Reformation ideas, although in this case it was all about politics. It had nothing to do with theology. But it does show that the Pope is losing power. Because now the king just said, Because now we have a king who just said, forget the Pope, I'm in charge now. Remember the whole Middle Ages? It was the Pope who was in power because the Pope put the crown on people. Gone are those days. And once again, the church has been challenged on everything it has been telling people has been true. So now it's time for the Catholic Church to respond in what we call the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, where the Catholic Church looks at all of these new Protestant movements and says, all right, we got to look at ourselves and we might have to make some changes. This meeting, called the Council of Trent in 1545, lasted for almost 20 years, and by the end of it, the Catholic Church officials came out and said, okay, here's what we believe for real this time. And they actually reaffirmed a lot of their existing beliefs, but there were some key changes. Like most notably, they threw out the indulgences thing and said, yeah, we agree, we believe you, grace through faith is the way you're saved, not by your works, but they do help. And so does going to church and getting sacraments and all that. It also created some things to avoid corruption in the church and some of the problems that they had been so criticized by the Protestants by. One such example is the formation of the Jesuits, also known as the Society of Jesus, led by a guy named Ignatius Loyola. This was a group that was meant to teach the Bible truly and avoid further corruption and heresy within the church. The Jesuits were also great missionaries and ambassadors for the Catholic Church, spreading the faith throughout the world and educating people on what the Bible actually said. In fact, there's several important Jesuit universities still in the United States today, most notably a school like Marquette or Gonzaga or Xavier. There's one part about the Jesuits I really like. They had this Latin phrase called magis, which meant for the greater glory of God, that everyone needs to be greater and they need to do things for Christ. Everything they do should go back to Christ. It's a great reminder. What can I do for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What should I do for Christ? If you're not asking yourself that, you're living a life that's really selfish. And this movement truly shows a lot about the Catholic Church as a whole and the fact that it becomes more devout and more theologically correct thanks to the Reformation to force the Catholic Church to change. Now, the Catholic Church doesn't go quietly, though. It does fight back with the Inquisition. The Inquisition was basically a legalized process in which individuals who were condemned as heretics against the church could be tortured and even killed. Not a great chapter in the Catholic Church. But overall, this is the culmination of the Protestant Reformation, which started with Luther's very simple 95 Theses, right? That call to talk about the problems in the church has now created a full-fledged, almost revolution within the church. And it's created all these different denominations that believe different things, most notably the Lutheran denomination. The Calvinist church will become known as the Presbyterian church. Of course, you have the Anglican church in England as well, and there's so many others that now Christianity is actually really divided. And that might not be a bad thing because most of these denominations are getting back to the Bible. And while there's some subtle differences, these churches really aren't that different. So that is probably a good thing. But yet at the heart of this is this continued pattern we see with Christians arguing over small things. Remember back with the Great Schism when the church first split? There was so much in that that really didn't matter. What matters is what Luther talked about. Word alone, grace alone, faith alone. The Bible is the most important thing. And you're saved by grace through faith. It's not what you do. That's a universal message for all, and that seems to be clear in almost all of these denominations. It's revolutionary, because no longer do you have to work for your salvation. You are saved, not because of what you did. All you have to do is believe in that. It's a really simple message to understand. It's going to allow Christianity to continue to spread. And there's a lot of reasons why these ideas came out. Obviously, we know the Catholic Church was flawed. It was only a matter of time for somebody to actually read the Bible and figure this out. But many would argue this only happens because of the printing press and because of humanist worldviews. Right? Humanism is all about us, ourselves. And in this new style of faith, the focus becomes on my individual faith. That's an enticing universal message. And in many ways, it makes our faith more personal, which is a good thing. I'm not demeaning that. But in some ways, it might also elevate our opinion of ourselves and actually cause us to focus more on ourselves rather than our faith. That's the danger here. That's the box that's been opened by Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the Renaissance, too. Humanist worldviews are only going to continue to grow, and so far they've made good changes. But what happens when the humanist worldview opens up a more selfish side of humans? What happens when people begin to continue to question not only the church, but everything else? Well, there's going to be a lot that happens. Even more change than we've seen already in this period. Once again, that's going to change the world. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.